Hi, I'm Dina, and today I'm going to show you my best trick for creating vibrant, warm, exciting skin tones with watercolors. We're using this photo as a reference, so feel free to just watch or paint along with me. This might not be a great watercolor secret, but it felt like one to me when I finally discovered it because I'd been painting watercolors for years before I started doing it this way. And it made such a big difference, and it made starting a portrait so much easier and so much more fun. So here's what you do. You wet down your whole paper with water, and you want to kind of make sure it's evenly covered, so just keep going over it a few times. Make sure it's really wet. When you paint on a wet surface, all the colors bleed and blend and soften and do all sorts of unpredictable things on your paper. And why I like to start my paintings like this is because we have a tendency to want to copy our reference photo exactly, and we get really caught up on small details. Instead, what I want to do is put down a base color that's vibrant, that's bright, that's fun, that's exciting, and that doesn't give me a chance to worry too much about detail and doesn't make me a slave to my reference photo. So what I like to do is look at my reference photo and pick out the most exciting and vibrant colors that I can find, even exaggerating them a little bit. So if you see a hint of an orange, make it a bright orange. If you see a hint of pink, make it a bright pink. Because these colors, number one, will dry lighter than they appear right now when they're wet. So though they may look darker than you want or brighter than you want, they will dry lighter. It won't be too dark or too bright if you're using enough water so that they all kind of soften and blend together like they're doing now. And it also gives you a chance to just loosen up and have fun. Painting should be fun. It isn't always, but when we can make it fun, why not? So the one thing that you should keep an eye on is your light and shadows. So you see this right side of her face where I'm putting all these darker, saturated, bright colors. That's the side of her face that's in shadow. But here, on the left side, I'm going to keep it very light. Now, I do want some color there. I don't want to leave it white, but I want to keep it light. So that's where the light's shining on. So you can put your brighter and more intense colors in the shadow areas, and chances are you're going to be putting in a few layers on top of this base color. So, you know, if the orange or the yellow ends up being too bright, you'll probably be covering it up with subsequent layers, which you can mute and make more neutral. All right, I'm going to remove a bit of paint here. Using a dry paintbrush, the paintbrush soaks up the paint that I don't want there because there's a strand of hair that's lighter than the face tone. So just took out some color there. And now, since we're moving on to some hair, she's got very light blonde hair. So I'm using just a very light base color just to start me off here. Again, not being super careful about your edges. If you go out of the lines, I actually am doing it on purpose. I don't want to get caught up in any amount of detail at all right now. I'm even letting the face and the hair color blend in a bit. One of the big mistakes that I see my students doing is making their base color too dull, too muddy, and too light. So remember, it will dry lighter than it looks. So always go a little bit darker and a little bit brighter than you're comfortable with. Okay, throw in some exciting colors. Now, not everybody likes bright colors, so if you really like to keep things neutral and muted, then that's totally fine as well. But this is a pretty bright and colorful painting, so I wouldn't be too worried about just having fun and experimenting here. I'm also lightening up some of this area right here that bled out from the skin color, because the hair is a lighter color. So just used a little water and blotted it up with a paper towel to lighten that, and now we'll put in more of the hair color, which is a kind of very, very diluted golden yellow. So it's a lot of water just to keep it light. Now when you're painting hair, it's important to look at it as just another mass, just another object that has light and shadow. I'm not going to really want to paint individual hairs right now. I want to look at it and see where are the lighter areas and where are the darker areas. So I'm starting with my lightest color just as a base and covering up all the hair area with this very light yellow. Keep in mind that blonde hair is usually not a bright, like canary yellow. Okay, it's usually more of a muted tone in the lighter areas. And then you look for the shadows. And I'm using kind of a just a reddish mixture here to show where the darker areas of the hair are. Again, although I'm creating strokes, and I always want to paint in the direction that the hair is growing, I'm not trying to paint individual hairs. I'm just trying to put in the areas where the hair is in shadow and where it will be darker. Any individual hairs or texture will come towards the end. This is just the process of mapping out my lights and darks and my shadow areas. I could use a more neutral color, like something that's more brown, but I know that all these colors are going to get covered up again anyway, so it doesn't really matter if I'm using something more red or more orange. This is just giving me an idea for future layers of where my light and shadow will be. Plus, I kind of like that there's kind of a pink undertone or tinge in her blonde hair. So I'm going in back to the face, and I'm going to, again, second layer here over my base color. And you can see I'm using a more neutral, like a golden brown color, so that any really bright colors that may be on my first layer are getting a bit neutralized here. And darkening. Well, this isn't actually a very neutral color. It's a pretty bright red-orange. But she does have very dark shadow on the side of the face. And again, if a color is ever too much or too bright, I can always add or change it on the next layer. So I like this warm, glowing color on the skin for now. Painting around the little extra strand of hair over there, and then using a damp brush to blend edges. Alright, looking for other areas now where I need to put in a darker shadow on her face. Like right here around the nose, we define the shape of the nose. So don't be afraid to use a nice intense color. Put it in as dark as you want to, and then I clean my brush and wipe it on a paper towel and use that damp, barely damp brush to blend the edges. And this second layer of color is when you get a little more precise with your details, because you have already this lovely glowing underpainting that you can work with. So you've got some good color there, and now you can work on adding more light and shadow, identifying the forms which will be created with the light and shadow, right? If you want to show that the eyes are set into a socket here, for example, right? It's the use of light and shadow that will give it depth. If you want to show round cheeks, again, it's your ability to use light and shadow that will give it the roundness. Putting down color and blending the edges. I'm not paying attention to the glasses right now because the frame is dark and I'll be able to paint the frame right over the colors that I have already. So we're now approaching kind of the messy middle, although we're only 10 minutes into this painting, but it will get worse before it gets better. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that there is a point in most paintings where you're just gonna think that everything's horrible and that it looks like a mess and that it's ruined and that you're a dismal failure as an artist. But just keep pushing through it and see how it goes. Blending out the color there on the nose to soften it up. And softening that again with a little bit of water and a damp brush. Starting to add a little bit more detail, the Cupid's bow there. Defining a bit of the shadow on this side of the upper lip. And blending the edges. Everything looks a little weird before you put in the eyes and the mouth, but I do like to get the light and shadow on the skin, on the face, usually before I go in with the details in the eyes and the mouth. So just keep looking at your reference and see what areas need to be lightened, what areas need to be darkened. A good tip is, if you're having trouble identifying your shadows, is to squint at your reference photo, and that will usually help you to see the light and shadow more clearly. Alright, so let's tackle that mouth. So mouths can be intimidating, but if you've got a good sketch, hopefully, that you've started out with, you can just kind of fill in the lines. So the top lip is often more defined and darker than the bottom lip. So I'm going in with a kind of reddish pinkish color here. Now for the bottom lip, I'm just obviously using the same color, as you can see, trying to leave a bit of the highlight there. Now, we don't really use white paint in watercolors, so whatever we want to leave white, we just have to paint around it. And I'm also blending a bit of the edge of the mouth here right into the shadow. Lips, especially children's lips, are very soft, and often the edges are not clearly defined. It's not like she's wearing lipstick, right? We don't want to give that impression. So just kind of blending some of the lip color into the shadow around it. If you're wondering about what colors I'm using in this painting, it's hard for me to tell you because, as you can see, I don't clean off my palette in between painting sessions. So when I'm mixing colors, I'm using paints that's already on my palette from before. So you can just pick your own colors. If it looks reddish, then pick a reddish color, and if it's not the right red, then try another red or mix in some orange or some yellow or some purple to darken it, and you'll be good. I don't really think it's that important to get the colors exactly right and to always match your colors perfectly to your reference picture, or if you're copying me, you don't have to copy, my colors exactly. The most important thing is the values. So if you are getting the shadows right, and your shadows are dark enough and your light areas are light enough, and you have good contrast and good transitions, so that's much more important really than what colors you're using. The colors are secondary, but of course you'll pop your painting up a notch if you do use vibrant and interesting colors. So don't be afraid to be a little bit adventurous with your colors. So we're darkening up the shadowy areas of the hair, and this is what will give the hair a sense of volume and depth, and also will give it some shine, because when hair is shiny, that's because there's some contrast there. The shine of the hair, the light color, will only show up if it's contrasted with darker shadowy areas of the hair, right? So you do want to always pay attention to your light and shadows on the hair as well. And even here, I'm trying to avoid painting some of the lighter areas of the hair, so I'm painting around them, but I'm still not really painting individual hairs. It's more like painting locks of hair, right? Like, as opposed to individual strands. However, if there is like one light strand of hair or something that's sticking out, we want to be able to paint around it so that we can still, so we don't lose that light area. Again, looking for the areas that are more in shadow, and blending the edges if I want them to be soft with a bit of water or a damp brush. Painting around the lighter shapes so that they now stand out. So it's what we call negative painting. And this is also where that base color comes into handy, because when I'm painting around the lighter areas, I've already got a base color, like they're already a light yellow, blonde color. So now I can go ahead with my dark colors and paint all around those areas. Every layer will darken it up a little bit more, and with every layer we can define our shapes and our values further. Going really dark now into that shadow area in there. It might be a bit too red right now, but if it is, we'll add in some more neutralized colors. Okay, so skipping ahead a little bit, you can see that I've added in a lot more shadow areas and some more colors and some more textures into the hair. Wherever there are dark shadows, I'm darkening them even further to show how some locks of hair are, you know, layered above other hairs and some are below, and there are little gaps in between which are darker. All this section down here is actually more in shadow, so I can significantly darken all that up. Using a damp brush to blend these edges. Putting some more of this dark color into the dark areas wherever I see that we need to darken things up. And again, remember, I'll keep repeating this because people tend to forget and people are scared to go too dark, but it will dry a bit lighter than it looks when it's wet. And we really need that contrast. It makes our painting more exciting. We don't want it to be washed out. So even though she has blonde hair, the trick here is to keep the light areas really light so that it looks blonde, but also be able to really darken those dark shadowy areas as well, so that we get the shine and the volume. And some little flyaway hairs around the edges. If your brush is dry, which mine is not dry enough, you can get finer lines. Okay, that's dry. Alrighty, so let's move on to the glasses now. If you look in the reference picture, they're very dark. They're like a very dark brown color and just not like very pretty. I don't particularly like that they're so dark and that they're like the first thing that you look at when you look at the photo. Rather than her cute face, right? So I'm gonna try to make them a little bit of a prettier color, maybe, and not as dark, because I do not feel like I have to be the slave to my reference picture, and I can choose to change the colors or to make them lighter or just to make them, you know, just a prettier kind of color here. Kind of blend in with some of the other colors that I've already used. So, as you can see, we're putting in a little bit of that golden brown, a little purple, a little fuchsia, a dark pink, and we'll do the same thing here. So, putting down some water here so the colors will all kind of blend together. And then into that wet area, I'm dropping in some colors. So instead of just using dark brown, I'm just trying to make it prettier, more interesting. Carefully painting this little wire connecting them. When you have a thin area to paint, you can always get a smaller paintbrush, or if you've got a good tip on your brush and some wrist control, you can just use whatever brush you've got, as long as it comes to a nice point. Alright, let's put a little color in the eyes. So when I'm doing eyes, I like to start with the lightest color that I can see. And if there's a highlight, like a little white spot, so make sure you save that white spot, which I didn't. So dabbing it with a paper towel. And let's do it again. So putting in that blue area and trying this time to go around wherever the white highlight is, so I can preserve that light area. Same thing on this eye, painting in that little base layer and preserving the highlight. And we'll wait for that to dry before we put in any darker colors into the eyes. And darken a bit of the eyelid above it. And see a little hint of the eyelid there, painting that in. See it right above the glasses frame and the lower eyelid. And do the same on the other eye. Just paint in that little hint of the upper eyelid that we can see. And blending that a bit into the shadow. Looking carefully for more shadows around the eye area. And these are subtle, but every subtlety makes a difference when you're painting a portrait. That's kind of why they're so intimidating, and why sometimes we struggle to get a likeness, is because every little nuance makes a difference, right? So that's why it's important to start out with an accurate sketch before you get into your painting. But even once you've got a sketch, a lot of the character and the shapes of the face are going to be depending on your ability to do the light and shadows properly, right? So using light and shadow, I could make her cheeks rounder, or I could make them flatter. I could make her nose wider or more narrow. I could make her eyes deep set or less so, right? So all those things are dependent on my shadow. Even if my sketch is accurate, I want to be very careful about getting the shadows in the right places as well. And we're still in the messy middle. Almost half an hour of painting, and we're definitely making progress, building layers, defining the features. Still building up those shadows, trying to find all those little areas now that need to be adjusted, like around the nose here, the little edge of the nose. Put in the color and then blend it. We're getting pretty dark right there around that little tip of the nose, the little side edge. Because it is in the deeper edge of the shadows. And now we're going to add some of that deeper color also right there on the bottom of the nose. Because if you think of the shape of a nose, it's curves. It's a ball. The tip of the nose is kind of a ball shape, and it curves under. So there is that shadow right there on the underneath side of the nose. Darkening that shadow there on the chin as well. We can put in a really dark color and then use a damp brush, not a wet brush. So as you can see, I'm wetting, cleaning off my brush, and then blotting it on a paper towel in order to use it for blending. And going up and really darkening that shadow in there. Picking up a little lighter color to define the edges here, and a damp brush to blend it. And do the same thing up here, really intensifying that dark shadow in there. Make it even darker. I'm adding some purple into that brown color. So now it's really pretty intense. Bringing some of that shadow here around into the hair so that it's not like an isolated section of dark, but it's shadow. So using that same dark intensity in just a couple strands of the hair over here. And now once I've got the base color of the hair and I've identified where the light and the dark sections are, I can go in and I can start to paint a few individual strands to give the impression of hair. Now I'm not going to obviously try to paint every single strand of hair, right? But just a few well-placed lines will give a good impression of hair. Here again, I'm defining this lighter strand of hair by darkening the area around it. It's an important thing to keep in mind when you're doing hair. Alrighty, let's move back to the eyes. So I've picked up some dark blue. This is an indigo blue. And I'm using it to paint in the dark edge around the eyes. I'm doing this carefully using the tip of my brush, and if your brush is too wet and has too much water in it, you'll have a hard time doing fine lines. So you want to clean your brush, dry it, and just pick up a tiny dab of paint so that you can do fine lines like that. Pupil in the middle, and you can see now that the base layer of blue that I put in looks very light now. So we may add some more color, but for now we're putting in the dark areas. So again, using the tip of the brush to paint in a very fine line around the edge of the eyes here. trying to keep an eye on my reference photo so I can see exactly what it's supposed to look like. Where is the highlight? Where is the pupil? Some of the pupil may be covered up by some of the highlight, so I can choose to move the highlight a bit or change the size of it. Again, something like that is something that I can fix and I can change. Darkening the little corner of the eye there. I'm using a dark purple, purplish red. Because the corner of the eye is usually warm, right? There's a little bit of red in there. Don't forget that, see that white area right between the eye, the iris, the colored part of the eye, and the eyelashes underneath? We don't want to forget that. We also don't want to forget that even the white of the eye is not always white. It's not a pure white. Sometimes there's shadows on it, so right under the eyelid here, painting a faint shadow there. This little corner is not white either, it's in a shadow. And while we're painting fine lines, we'll put in that line there between the lips. Try to get it in the right place. If you don't, you can just dab it out like I did and try again. Some of that line may be thicker and some of it might be really thin, so you can keep an eye on the width of the line. It doesn't have to be equal or consistent. And darken up a bit of the nostril, a bit of the edge of the nose there. As you build up your painting, you'll start to realize that the areas that you thought were really dark might not be dark enough. So you just can keep adding layers and keep darkening things. Here I'm darkening this, but also adding some red. Give her that kind of rosy cheeked look. Damp brush to blur the edges there. Just keeps getting darker and darker on that side of the face. Okay, so my camera stopped filming for some reason, but you can see that I painted in the dark circles around the glasses here, the top and the bottom lenses. So again, using a fine paintbrush or your regular paintbrush and just using the tip and trying to use just a bit of drier paint to paint these fine lines. If your brush is saturated with water, it'll be very hard to get thin lines. You can always practice on a scrap paper before you go into your actual painting. So did a lot of hard work there in the hair and in the face, so you can just maybe put a bit of color into the dress here and do something a little bit less stressful. I want to keep the edges kind of soft here and faded away, so I'm going to take some water and just kind of blend it out. It's like a collar that's going over her shoulder, so I guess there's kind of some shadow there under the collar. and bring it around the back. And we'll just fade that color right into the shadow that we've already got there. Darken again the shadow there right under the collar. And giving it a little bit of a warmer color there on the skin. And using a damp brush just to blend that edge a bit, soften it. Soften that down there. Dark color and fade it away. And there's her neck here, so let's differentiate between the neck and the collar. So we're going to put in this darker shadow here around the hair and also around the neck. There's a bit of negative painting there to capture that little strand of hair. Intensifying those shadows even a bit more because we love contrast and we want to get a lot of contrast in there where we need it. So these little areas of really intense shadow are often what can make or break a painting. So that's really dark in there, and then I want to get a little bit of transition there onto the neck. Just a hint of a shadow under the chin and blend it. It's a very soft, small area of shadow there. Thinking that maybe there should be some shadow under the hair. On the where it falls onto the white collar, it would cast a shadow. So putting in some dark purple there and then blending it. Some areas just never seem to get dark enough, so just can keep layering color on as you need to. Still putting dark areas in there as well. Here it's also adding a bit of hair texture, some strands of hair. Okay, adjusted my camera and my table here so the sun wasn't shining directly on my paper. So now we're going back into the eyes with a more intense blue because the initial layer of blue that I put down now looks very washed out. So we're adding in a brighter blue and still trying to preserve the white highlights in there. And it looks like we should put a little more color into the lips as well. The darker lip, as I mentioned, is usually, the upper lip is usually darker than the underlip. That's because the plane is sloping inward and it's downward. It's kind of under. This part of the lip curves under as well. So we've got that shadow there. We don't have to outline the lips. You can see how sometimes there's little spaces that are soft or that blend into the skin around the lips, right? So just look at your reference picture and see where there are hard edges, which are very strong and defined, and where there are softer, blurred edges. And that'll always be important, especially when you're painting lips. The corner of the lips is often a dark point, and that line in the middle between the upper and the lower lip. And there's those white highlights. Okay, let's go back into the eyes and darken up the pupils again. This is using an indigo blue, a very dark, almost black it appears here, and you can use black for little areas like this, but I just like the look of the indigo blue. It's really dark without going black. Darken up some part of the frame. And can blend some of those dark areas into the lighter areas using a damp brush. She's got a pattern on her dress, which I'm kind of ignoring, but I'm gonna just put a bit of a design on the collar so that it ties in with the rest of the dress. So I may put more colors in later, but I'm always looking for ways to simplify things and to cut down on the work that I need to do, because there's plenty of work that goes into painting a portrait. So if there's areas I can simplify without sacrificing anything too important, then I'll do that. Okay, we're gonna tackle the background. Now I want to keep the background pretty minimal. It doesn't need anything much. And I'm starting with a layer of water, just putting some water around the hair. The reason that I want to put some background in is because the hair is so light around the edges that if I put a bit of a background there, it'll pop it out. And we don't even really technically need a background. Like, I think it's fine the way it is, but I think it'll just give a little extra something. So we'll see how that looks. So I've put some water around the edges of the hair where I think I want to stick my background. I'm starting with a bit of this blue and adding in a little bit of purple. Keeping the edges soft here because I've put water on this area. So right now there aren't many hard edges except down there. There's a bit of a hard edge. I'm using my big brush because I just want to put in a little bit of color, but I don't want, it's not a detail area where I need a small brush, and this will just keep things flowing better. And I'm just picking out some other colors from my painting. So some of this pink, I'm putting that in around the hair. I'm adding some water just to blur the edges. I want to keep her hair soft. It's a little bit, it's not fuzzy exactly or frizzy, but we don't need many hard lines there. A few hard lines, a few soft edges. And we don't need to completely surround her with a background. We can just put it in wherever we feel like we want to. I'm keeping my paint really, really wet so that any colors that I add will just blend. And carefully going around the edges here. Backgrounds can sometimes be very complicated, so it's best not to overcomplicate it, which is what I'm going to try to do here, to keep things pretty simple. Just trying to decide how much. Is that enough of a background, or do I want to add a bit more here? Bring it down so that it's kind of matches the other side a bit. And see if we can just let it fade off there. That was the main thing. I wanted to just have the hair pop out, and the bottom part, don't really think we need so much background. Dab away some of that paint there that I didn't want, that edge. Soften that with a paper towel so it gets kind of like a halo effect, kind of. And you can really only fix it as long as it stays wet. Once your background dries, you know, you want to try not to mess with it too much, although you could do a whole nother layer if you wanted to make it darker. Here I'm actually removing paint. If my paintbrush is dry and I go into wet paint, it'll soak up the paint. Here I'm using water now to soften that edge there, that hard edge. Blot it, soften that. Again, soften that with water and then blot it with a paper towel. It just gives me that soft edge. I don't really want a hard edge around her hair, just because number one, I don't want to draw attention to it, and number two, I want to show that the hairs are like fly away, kind of like soft and angelic. Let's try to soften this round watermark over here, just getting in a little bit more paint on it, and add some water, just whatever we can do to soften that up. Alright, so now we're gonna look back at our portrait and look for the areas that we forgot about or that we still want to fix. So we've got this dark area in the bangs here. Gonna try to add a bit of color in there, just using a warm brown. Painting in the direction of the hairs and trying to fix the values, so make it darker where it needs to be darker, and also adding some of those hair textures while I'm at it. So if we've got hair, they'll cast a shadow on her forehead underneath, which is what this little area is. And it's using a light color here to put in some really light hairs, because this is in the sunshine. The side of her head is light, so we don't want any darks. I just want to lightly add in a little texture there. And because I'm trying to get fine lines here, so I'm trying to work with a paintbrush that's kind of dry, not loaded with water. Softening up some of these edges up here. Just, I don't know, they look too much contrast up there. Lightening up that one and blotting it out as well. Because sometimes when you have areas of high brightness, like really in the bright sun, so the sun bleaches the details out. Alright, let's put some dark here in the bangs in the darker area. So this is purple. I kind of like the pinks and purples in here, just gives it a really girly vibe. So using the purple in the darkest areas here. And then we'll blend in some of the warm brown to kind of soften up that purple. Add some other dark areas that are not as dark as the purple. Again, like I am creating some hair texture here, but the more important part is to identify the light and dark areas and the shapes that the dark shadows are making. So if you can't focus on both of those things, focus on just the shapes of the light that the light and the shadow makes, and worry about the hair texture after that. You can just add in some strands of hair on top of it. A little more negative painting, see how we just popped out that little strand of hair by painting little darker colors around it. And once we've got the dark and light, we can add the little hair textures, just a few little lines. Keeping it really light in the sunlight. Now there's a place that I want to lighten up, so I'm using a brush with some water on it. And I'm rubbing the water into the area that I want to lighten, and then dabbing it with a paper towel. So you see that removes some of the paint. We can do it again here. So I'm rubbing out a light area using clean water. Dab it with the paper towel, and you see how you've got those blonde streaks coming through the hair. Try it again here. Rub out a streak of blonde hair. So people who say you can't fix watercolors or you can't erase them, you know, sometimes it's easier to do than other times. But there are definitely ways that you can make little edits like that. And there, fix that bit also. Rubbing out that part too, lightening a bit over there. And taking out that strand as well, a little bit lighter. Even it's still in shadow, but we can see some streaks of lighter hair. So now that we're nearing the end of this portrait, it's just a lot of little edits, you know. Make a little bit darker here, add a few strands of hairs there. It's a lot of just finagling with things that, like, we could call this finished as it is. But you know, it's never over till it's over. And if you're using a reference picture and you keep just looking back and forth, you know, you'll keep noticing things that need to be fixed or darkened. But sometimes it's definitely helpful, and sometimes it's really unnecessary. You just, you know, keep finding little things to change. But that is sometimes the challenge of knowing when to finish your painting and when to stop. Sometimes we go too far, so we always want to be careful. Sometimes it's nice to leave areas kind of loose and more undefined. Hair is often a place that looks really good unfinished. I may have overworked her hair just a little bit and added too much detail, too much color, but it is what it is. Alright, had to adjust my painting again because the sun keeps moving, and when it shines that bright square on my paper, it just throws off all the color here. So anyway, I'm back to finagling, just adding more color and deepening shadows, always looking for those areas of contrast that need a little more work. Just softening this color around here. Believe it or not, I'm gonna go another shade darker here. Just back with my purple and a little bit of damp brush to blend it in. Trying to decide if this was necessary or not. I don't really know, but sometimes it's hard to resist the temptation to just really make those shadows nice and deep. There's a little bit that's bothering me right here. Softening this with water so we can get rid of this hard edge over here where the purple and the white meet. So I'm rubbing in some water to soften it and then blotting it up and just rubbing in a little more water and softening that area. And then we'll go in and fix the hairs that also got erased. A couple little loose flyaway hairs around the edges. Okay, the last thing I want to do is just darken up the shadow on her arm here. which is something that I feel like I may regret because it does look okay the way it is. But there's such a deep shadow on her face on that side. I feel like maybe we should also deepen some of the shadow here on her arm. So let's hope we don't make a mess of it. Sometimes these little final touches that we think we really need turn out to be something we could have done without. It was also a bit streaky, the paint on her arm, so just try to darken the shadow and also smooth out some of that color. We'll see if we are successful. Using a little bit of water to try to smooth out some of the edges. That's the shadow. It's coming from under the collar and wrapping around her shoulder there. Just streaky here. It's hard to try to fix paint that's already dried. And you go over it too much, you overwork it, and it loses the freshness that the first couple layers had. So I'm thinking that now I've made it too dark and too bright. Neutralize that, putting a little purple in so that it's not so red. Calls a lot of attention to that area, being so bright. And try to maybe remove some color here, soften it, blot it, whatever we can do now. Damage control. Alright, so again, here we have the original photo and the watercolor version. Let me know what you think. Do you think that is an improvement on the original photo? Do you like the brighter, more vibrant colors, or do you prefer something more muted and more neutral? I'd love to know what you think. Leave me a comment and like and subscribe for more fun art videos. Have a great day.